Welcome to the Common Man Football Show. My name is James Coburn, and today's episode we have a listener request from talented underscore TENNTH. He says, could you do the Titans 2015 second round? Kevin Dodd, 2016 second round. Kevin Dodd, Austin Johnson, and Derrick Henry. They were all players that are trapped behind talented starters and fell in the draft for one reason or another. And yeah, I think we can do that class in terms of second rounders. You may not like what I say about all of them, but I mean, I'm going to give you as positive of a portrayal as I can about what they look like on paper. Now, if you're not familiar with any of this stuff that I do in terms of data, I'm going to leave terms and definitions in the description. So if you're not familiar with market share data, I'm going to leave some definitions there in terms of what market share data is. If you're not familiar with athleticism data, I'm going to leave definitions there in terms of the athleticism data that I use and how I get to those numbers. And then, of course, looking at NFL production as well, which also just deals with market share data. So if you're not familiar with market share data, if you don't know what a speed score is, if you don't know what a flexibility score is, just go to the description. If you're still not familiar with it, you can always watch some of my older videos where I talk about this stuff in more detail. And if you still don't have a clue, just leave a comment below. So that's basically how it's going to work. So let's get to the second rounders in terms of the guys that they drafted, specifically Kevin Dodd, Derrick Henry, and of course, Austin Johnson. So starting out with Derrick Henry, because this is probably the main guy that most of you guys are going to be interested in anyways. He was very good in terms of production. He had a 91.01 market share production score. In terms of 1969, that's as far back as this goes. The majority of All-Pro, 5-time All-Pro type running backs had at least 89 or higher. 5-time Pro Bowl types had 69 or higher, and 3-time Pro Bowl types had 52 or higher in terms of the majority of those types. So Derrick Henry kind of graded out really well in terms of production. It's not surprising. Because he was a very productive back. Like, if you just looked at his production on paper, you would go, oh, yeah, he's pretty productive. But it's just when you actually quantify it in terms of market share terms, he was pretty much in that sort of elite tier of production data. And then when you actually get to his athleticism data, this is where he also showed out to be pretty decent as well. Had a 99.01 explosive lower body strength score, 93.65 speed score, and 78.22 flexibility score. Based on my data as well, when it comes to multiple All-Pro, multiple Pro Bowl types, most of those guys need at least one 79 or higher athleticism trait. So every single multiple All-Pro and Pro Bowl running back had at least one athleticism trait that was 89 or higher. That's the best way to kind of think of that, because there are certain running backs who are not very explosive, not very fast, but are very flexible. LaShawn McCoy is probably the best example of a back like that. Frank Gore is another sort of guy who's kind of like that. You know, guys that weren't very fast, weren't very explosive, but definitely very flexible. Of course, Chris Johnson is an example of a back who's really, really fast, but not very explosive. And then, of course, you have other backs that are just very explosive, but not very fast and not very flexible. Not as many of those guys, but, you know, it's still a sort of athleticism trait. And mainly, if you think about these athleticism traits, speed is about the ability to run away from people. Flexibility deals with their ability to get leverage, and it also helps with breaking tackles as well, and just general quickness, you know, in terms of change of direction skills. And then, of course, explosiveness is explosiveness. Explosiveness deals with when people talk about burst, or they talk about dat move, you know, where they kind of plant their foot and boom. That's explosiveness, people. So that's a lot of times what they're talking about when it comes to explosiveness. It's not necessarily speed as much as explosiveness. You know, there's a difference between speed and explosiveness. Is all I'm trying to say. But for the most part, Derrick Henry checks all the boxes in terms of this stuff. But only one area of concern. When it comes to the 3-cone, the vast majority, 95% of multiple All-Pro and Pro Bowl running backs since the 1999 NFL draft class, they had a 3-cone of 7.09 or less. And the only back to not have a 7.09 3-cone or less, who went on to become a multiple Pro Bowl type, was DeMarco Murray, who's on the Titans right now. But for the most part, that's the only sort of concern with Derrick Henry. His 3 cone of 7.20 doesn't hit that 7.01 area. Because of that, it kind of drops into a different sort of tier of prospects. Because of that, however, I wouldn't be surprised if he became an outlier. Because again, a lot of times when a guy becomes an outlier, it's because they have a lot of positives already there, and they just seem to fight through it. Basically. So even though they don't really match up with all the other sort of running backs, they're still able to do it. With Derrick Henry, he has really good production, and he has really above average athleticism traits. In terms of his explosiveness and his speed, he's elite when it comes to his explosiveness and speed, and he has very good flexibility for his size, and he's a giant running back. If you think of it from that perspective, it's not surprising if Derrick Henry were to become an outlier. It's just to understand that there hasn't been that many backs. There's only been one back since 1999 in that time span who didn't have a 7.09 or less 3 cone to go on to become a multiple Pro Bowl, multiple All-Pro type. Then when you get to his NFL production, this is compared to every single back at the NFL level since the 1994 NFL draft class. And he had a 3.2 in terms of his production. And I have got some questions about Derrick Henry before in terms of, well, he's sitting behind a talented back, in DeMarco Murray, which he is. And there's sort of the question of, what does this say about a guy like this? He can't beat out the starter. And honestly, there's some positive things to point to. Compared to backs at Derrick Henry's age, so this is all the backs from 1994 to 2016. This is the guys in his production range and also his age, 22 years old. There's a fair share of backs in this area that were successful. Napoleon Kaufman, of course, is one guy in here. Marion Barber is close to Derrick Henry as well. Chris Ivory, Jamal Charles is probably the big name that you'll probably gravitate to. Thomas Jones, of course, who has been a very productive running back. That isn't something to kind of laugh at. And, of course, Darren McFadden. So for the most part, Derrick Henry didn't have the best rookie season, ever. However, I do think that there is enough things here that, he could end up being a part of a starter, because he does have a legit reason. Jamal Charles in that season in particular, he was basically sharing carries with Thomas Jones. So there is, if you're still curious about this kind of stuff, you can go to these backs and kind of look at what their situations were like during those particular seasons. But the bottom line is I don't think there's too much to worry about Derrick Henry. I would just preach patience at this point, because a lot of times, if a back doesn't have a very good rookie season, that isn't the worst thing in the world. It's just something to kind of monitor to see what he does this year, what he does the next year, and so on and so forth. So I would say what's really going to define Derrick Henry's career in the NFL is what he does in his sophomore year and what he does in his junior year. Those are big years in terms of breakout potential and all the other kind of stuff. So for the most part, Derrick Henry did not have the best rookie season, but it wasn't so horrible to think that he could possibly have sort of a breakout year in the future. Based on his production in college and also based on his athleticism data. I think there's some positives there. So I would say just be patient and see what happens in the future. But I don't think there's, he wasn't like unproductive, like he didn't miss an entire season to injury. So I don't think there's anything like that to be too worried about with Derrick Henry. It's just to be patient and then see what happens in the future with him. Then next up we have Kevin Dodd. When it comes to his production, he had a 78.67 solo tackle market share score, a 61.93 sack market share score, and a 71.67 tackle for loss market share score. Based on his production, he pretty much hits all the sort of bottom thresholds for a Pro Bowl potential edge rusher. So all the production marks are pretty much checked when it comes to Kevin Dodd. But his athleticism is really where most of his issues kind of show up. Based on his athleticism data, he has a 43 explosive lower body strength score, a 60.12 speed score, and a 64.15 flexibility score. His flexibility testing does not hit the bare minimum threshold when it comes to multiple Pro Bowl players. His explosion and speed score does. But I think the bigger issue with Kevin Dodd is really his age. He was a rookie at 24 years old, and for the most part, based on my data, He didn't really hit the sort of area where multiple All-Pro edge rushers exist when it comes to their age coming out, and he doesn't really hit the area when it comes to multiple Pro Bowl players either when it comes to age coming out. So that was really the only major negative with Kevin Dodd, is that even though he did have the bare minimum production of a Pro Bowl player, even though he does have some positives in terms of his athleticism to suggest a potential outlier maybe, because his flexibility isn't terrible. It's just it doesn't quite hit the bottom threshold, But the bigger issue is just his age. He's a very older prospect. Age in many ways speaks to the potential upside of a prospect. The younger a player is, the higher the chance of that player becoming a very high quality player is. And in Kevin Dodd's case, he doesn't really hit the flexibility testing he needs to hit to be a high quality player, nor does he hit the age that he needs to hit to become a high quality player. And then not only that, if you actually look at his NFL production as a 24-year-old, his production just has not been that great. Basically, his solo tackle market share, sack market share, his total impact score, which combines both those scores compared to peers, was only 8.38 out of 100. So he was very much a non-impact kind of guy as a rookie, and I don't think it gets much better from here. I just think when it comes to his profile, there are some positives, there are some things that made you think, what if? But I just don't think that there's enough here to suggest that he'll ever be a high-quality player. He could develop into a long-term starter, but that is probably the bare minimum I would expect out of Kevin Dodd as a long-term starter, because he's just a very, very old prospect. And on top of that, just doesn't quite have all the athleticism traits that you want in terms of a high-quality player either. And then when you get to the last prospect, which is Austin Johnson, similar sort of scenario, sort of base of this production, he has an 86.08 solo tackle market share score, 63.76 sack market share score, and a 79.91 tackle for loss market share score. Based on this data, he pretty much has all the sort of production marks of a potential Pro Bowl type defensive tackle. He's only about 1 point away from the All-Pro area, so if he was just a little bit more productive in terms of solo tackle market share, he would actually hit the potential All-Pro production sort of area of things. But his issue is with athleticism data. Only had a 25.94 explosive lower body strength score, 21.09 speed score, and 29.34 flexibility score. Based on his testing with that, he doesn't really hit the All-Pro threshold when it comes to his testing, and doesn't really hit the Pro Bowl athleticism. This is bottom end threshold when it comes to athleticism data. And when it comes to that sort of athleticism data, he just doesn't quite hit the sort of marks he needs to hit. He does hit the long-term starter threshold, though. If you look at his explosiveness, his speed, his flexibility, it's above the bottom end threshold when it comes to long-term starters. But he just isn't quite where he needs to be in terms of Pro Bowl potential, All-Pro potential based on his data. So essentially what you have is a defensive tackle who hits all the sort of production marks that you would want a guy like him to hit, but doesn't hit the athleticism marks that he needs to hit in terms of high-quality player. And as a result, when you go to Austin Johnson in terms of his production at the NFL level, he had below average solo tackle market share, below average sack market share score, and the only sort of thing that was above average was his pass deflection market share of a 61.03 out of 100. And his total impact overall was only 28.48. So he basically was a below average impact rookie as well when it comes to Austin Johnson. So he's another guy that I think, based on his data, I think there is the possibility that he could end up becoming a long-term starter because of his production. I mean, I never rule out a guy when they have production like that, because there are lots of players who hit the sort of bare minimum thresholds for starters with the production who end up becoming long-term starters. It's just that I would not expect him to become a multiple Pro Bowl type. I would not expect him to become a multiple All-Pro type. And I don't expect him to even produce like most of the high-quality nose tackles do. And you can watch the Danny Shelton video as well if you want more sort of information on nose tackle types, because he just doesn't quite have the sort of athleticism traits indicative of a high-quality nose tackle type either. So I just think when it comes to Austin Johnson, best case scenario, he becomes a long-term starter. I think worst case, he just continues to be sort of a backup rotational type of guy. Then the last player to talk about is Austin Johnson. Based on his production, he had an 86.08 solid tackle market share score, a 63.76 sack market share score, and a 79.91 tackle for loss market share score. All those marks are very decent. He hits pretty much every single production mark that you want from a defensive tackle, so that really isn't the issue for him. Where his issue really exists is in terms of his athleticism data. Only had a 25.94 explosive lower body strength score, 21.09 speed score, and 29.34 flexibility score. In many ways, he's below average in terms of every single metric when it comes to his athleticism data, and that's a problem. He doesn't really match up with the All-Pro thresholds in terms of the position, the Pro Bowl thresholds in terms of the position. He does hit at least the bare minimum in terms of starter thresholds, so there is potential that he could develop into a long-term starter because he pretty much has sort of the bare minimums to kind of do that, but it is a little concerning that he's a below-average athlete overall when it comes to his profile, which is kind of a concern. And then when you actually get to his NFL data, he has been pretty much below average in terms of everything except for pass deflection market share, where he was a little bit above, but his overall total impact was below average with a 28.48 overall score in 2016. The bottom line of Austin Johnson is he's someone that I would not be too surprised if he develops into a long-term starter, but I think high-quality outcomes are just off the table with him, especially since none of his athleticism traits hit any of the sort of high-quality areas they need to hit in terms of explosiveness and speed. I do understand that some people might go, well, he's a nose tackle. That's true, but if you've seen any of my previous videos on nose tackles, like the Danny Shelton video in particular, in that video I kind of went over some of the facts that nose tackles that are really good usually have some sort of above average athleticism trait, where there's explosiveness, flexibility, or speed. In Austin Johnson's case, none of it is above average. So I would say the best case scenario is he becomes a long-term starter, but long-term, I really just see a guy who's more so going to be a rotational backup kind of guy. So in conclusion, I don't mean to be the bearer of bad news, but I think the best prospect out of that group I just mentioned is Derrick Henry. He has the production traits you're looking for. He has above average athleticism traits. He's not a perfect prospect because of his 3-cone, though. However, I would not be surprised if he ended up becoming a long-term starter or a high-quality player, because he has a lot of things pointing towards success in terms of his production, in terms of his above-average athleticism traits. And he's such a unique prospect in its own. You know, how often do you find a back that's that big? You usually don't. So I think there is some of a case to say that he could be an exception and become a multiple Pro Bowl or multiple, maybe not multiple All-Pro, but at least a multiple Pro Bowl type. I think there's a lot of things pointing towards that potential based on his production, based on his athleticism, and also based on his production as a rookie. When it comes to the other players with Kevin Dodd, it's not a very good start for a 24-year-old to have the type of season that he had, on top of his other issues when it comes to his age coming out, and also his athleticism data just not becoming sort of where it needs to be. I mean, the basic thing with Kevin Dodd is that you're asking a guy to not only become an outlier when it comes to age, but also an outlier when it comes to his athleticism. And whenever you have to, whenever you have whenever you have too many hurdles to hoop, to jump over, it's just not worth it. So I would say Kevin Dodd, future-wise, I don't see as many good things with him. I think the best case, he might turn into a long-term starter, but I really think at this point you're just looking at a backup rotational kind of pass rusher, at least in the future. And then, of course, when it comes to Austin Johnson, he had the production, but he didn't quite have the athleticism data indicative of a high-quality defensive tackle. His rookie season also wasn't the best ever. I still think that he has some potential to develop into a long-term starting defensive tackle, but I just don't think that he's ever going to become like a high-quality NFL defensive tackle because of his athleticism traits. So, again, my name is James Coburn. You can find my work at draftcoburn.wordpress.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at Geometrics. And if you like this content and you want more content like this, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Share this video as well with anybody that you know, and I'll talk to you guys in the next video. Peace.